According to Alan Watts, there are only two types of psychotherapists possible. You have to fall into one camp or the other, and there's nothing at all in between. One type of therapist is what Alan Watts calls the social adjustment therapist. And in a way, we could say that they see it as their job to adjust or readjust the client back to society. Though in another way, we can't say that they see it as their task or their role, because they don't. They just see their task as helping the client in the only way they can. And the other type of therapist is the type who Alan Watts describes as standing with the client against the rest of the world, against all the requirements and expectations that society puts on them, the family puts on them, the friends, this huge weight of expectations and conditioning that exists out there in the world. So this type of therapist, instead of adjusting the client to fit that better so they'll get on in life more smoothly, they stand with the client in their movement out of adaptation, out of this state of adaptation. So that's it. And obviously most of us working in mental health care, whether we want to be or not, we're social adjustment therapists. And we can't help it. It doesn't make any sense to pick someone and say, oh, you're socially conditioned. What's wrong with you? Are you stupid or what? We could pick anyone on the street and lambast them for being socially conditioned. But that just doesn't make any sense, really, because, of course, we're socially conditioned. That's the default. We don't know we're socially conditioned. We have no way of knowing it. No one we know knows that we're socially conditioned or that they're socially conditioned. So how can we be culpable for it? So we can't really blame anyone for it. But on the other hand, we do have to observe the very pertinent fact that when it comes to working with people who are going through great mental distress and turmoil, merely inflicting our unexamined assumptions, our societal conditioning on them, either overtly or covertly, is really not the helpful thing to do. So society channels us in the direction of becoming therapists or counsellors or psychotherapists or whatever, just the same as it channels us in the direction of becoming anything. There are mechanisms in society that allocate roles for us. Often in the West, it does seem as if we're given a choice, in that at various stages we get to think about it and say, what's right for me? To some extent that is true. But of course, all the choices we are given are of societally conditioned roles, and so they're all the same. All societally conditioned roles are legitimate modes of that society. So society is basically giving us the choice of being adapted to it. Only, of course, that isn't much of a choice, really. That's the big choice we're given. You've got the choice of being optimally adapted to society or nothing. That's all it is. There is no other. There is no other thing. So society does train us to be different things. So society, all the mechanisms within society. It could be your career guidance officer, it could be your parents. They're saying, you be this, you be that, you be pharmacist, you be doctor, you be teacher, you be baker or candlestick maker or whatever. And then that's fine, we go ahead and do it, and that's generally okay. If you are a pharmacist or a candlestick maker, it doesn't make that much difference if you're societally conditioned. Ultimately it does because you can never do anything and bring your individual self into it when you're socially conditioned. But in terms of the job itself, I don't think you can tell the difference. If you've got a baker who is socially conditioned and they make a loaf, and someone else who isn't make a loaf, it's still a loaf, I suppose. But we're not really concerned with baking so much as psychotherapy, and it's a different matter in psychotherapy. So when we move through life and the kind of career trajectory, we end up being a counsellor or a therapist, then it doesn't matter how much training we have. It's not going to stop us being socially conditioned, because training is conditioning. The more training we have, the more conditioned we are. And you can see that with professions that are very, very highly trained, equally we can say that they're very, very highly brainwashed. It doesn't make any difference really. Their reality tunnel is determined for them, and it's very, very narrow, and they go into a state of shock if anyone tries to say anything that conflicts with this reality tunnel. There's a huge amount of rigidity and narrowness there, and that's what training always does. You can't train people not to be narrow. You can train them to be narrow, but not broad. Broadness never comes from training. So, if I'm a therapist or a counsellor, and I haven't become liberated from my conditioning, as Alan Watts says, then what happens is I have to inflict it on everyone I meet. That's all I can do. I'm just a social unit inflicting my conditioning on everyone else as if it isn't conditioning but the only right and proper way to be. So here's me, a therapist, and I've been brought up by my parents, just as they were brought up by their parents, to believe in this truly absurd fantasy world that doesn't exist, but which does exist pragmatically because we never question it, and I never question it. So I'm there in this fantasy world. It is a pure fantasy world. And then when I meet people who have become frighteningly and painfully dislocated from the reality that has been determined for them by their families and by society, I can't help judge them on some level. I can actually read all the Carl Rogers books they are, from cover to cover, 10 times, and I can have Carl Rogers coming out of my ears. But if I'm socially conditioned, I am always going to judge people for not being socially conditioned, for not being formatted, for not having their minds formatted in the same way that my mind is formatted. We can see that this is the case. One good, I don't know if good is the right word, one clear manifestation of this is when healthcare staff start becoming unduly politically correct about the clients they're dealing with, and they go out of their way to make sure that they don't say anything that could be remotely interpreted as being dismissive of them or judgmental of them, and they won't tolerate anyone else doing the same. Now, on the face of it, you might think this is a good thing, although kind of we know it isn't, because politically correct people are so obviously up themselves. But what this really shows is this terrible conflict that we have. Like, we know we shouldn't be judging, yet in as much as we are socially conditioned, what that really means is that we are governed by our thinking, and thinking by its very nature always judges. That's what thinking is. It's judging. Is it this? Is it that? If it's this, then it's that. If it's that, then it's the other. The mechanism of thought is to judge. So if we're trapped in our minds, we will judge, because we are creatures of the thinking mind. And it's utter absurdity to suggest that we can somehow magically create this lovely non-judgmentalism out of thin air, just because it's the right thing to do, and we know it's the right thing to do, which itself is a judgment, of course. So this situation arises where we are conflicted, because on a deep level we know we are judgmental as hell, and yet we know that's completely incompatible with being a therapist or healthcare worker. So what we do is we make a big song and dance about how correct we are, and we get very, very righteous and annoyed with everyone else when they aren't meeting our very high standards of apparently being non-judgmental. You really have to be on your toes for this game. But of course it is all false. It's got nothing to do with anything than the desire or need to pretend to be what we aren't, which we can't be. We can't be what we aren't. When we try to, we create toxicity. So you're better off being judgmental than being judgmental and pretending not to be judgmental. So there is no way to function in a genuinely helpful way unless we have been liberated from, on the one hand we could say, societal conditioning, and on the other hand we could say that generic mind that's given to us, if not at birth, shortly afterwards, like a little present. Here's the generic mind. You can now think as everyone else thinks, and this generic mind will determine how you understand yourself and what life is all about, and you're never allowed to go beyond this generic mind. So something has to happen to break us free from that. And yet that's outside, as I was saying, that's outside the remit of social structures. It's outside the remit of any organised system of education, which creates a huge dilemma. What do we do about that? And obviously we can't do anything about it, because as soon as we try to address it and develop our own system, all we're doing is introducing a new type of conditioning. So although we might feel that we're liberating ourselves or other people from the narrow conventional reality tunnel, we're just providing a different type of conditioning. So we think we've got somewhere, but we haven't, or we think we're liberated, but we're not. There's no systematic way to decondition anybody, because all systems are conditioning. All groups of people who hang about together and have the same way of looking at things are conditioning, even if they might think that they are aware and not as hopelessly conditioned as everyone else. It's just a question of refinement, really. So what this shows is that we can't, in any way at all, separate what we call therapy from the larger social context. It's crazy to think we can, because the larger social context shows itself in every single thing, everything we say, everything we think. It comes out through us. That's what we are. We are a microcosm of the social macrocosm. And if the social context is the problem, which more and more people are coming to see that actually that is where the problem lies, in our conformity to this very limited way of existing or living, then we have to primarily concern ourselves with that, and rather than on the technicalities of what you might learn on a counselling course and all the little things, reflecting stuff back, or active listening. All of that stuff is completely meaningless unless we can actually question the social assumptions which we have been imprinted with. Which, in all fairness, in some schools of psychotherapy, that would be part of the education, so that would be addressed in a kind of a way. But then, as I said a minute ago, any school of psychotherapy is distinguishable as a school of psychotherapy and not a different school by the fact of its conditioning and nothing else. And we're kind of considering its conditioning as something special to make it more true. It's just conditioning, the same as any other conditioning. So we really need to look at what the hell society is about. What is its thing? What is it really about? And what we can very quickly say about this, and very interestingly say, is that society is all about creating this thing which we could call the rational ego, or the concrete self. It's a machine for creating and perpetuating this thing that we could call the rational ego. And the rational ego, or concrete self, is an affliction. It's an affliction and it's a self-contradiction. Being conflicted with oneself 100% is an affliction, obviously. There's no way that can be considered to be an okay kind of a thing. So the ego is conflicted or self-contradictory in the sense that it has two faces. It's an entity with two faces. One face is the euphoric face, the happy, everything is great face, and being nice to people face, isn't it? Isn't everything great? So it's an agreeable, pleasant face. And to the same extent that that face is there, there's also the counterbalancing face of the grumpy, cross, dysphoric, rotten, blaming face. So every single person, when they are wholly identified with the rational ego, has this double characteristic, which is kind of unsettling, to say the least. So you might meet someone and think, they're a really nice person, aren't they great? So you kind of hook up with them, and maybe you marry them or go out with them, and you discover, well, they're not such a nice person at all. They've got this really rotten side to them, which is pretty much a universal discovery, I think, once you do go down that road of going out with someone and then throwing your lot in together and becoming, whether you're married or just you're living together. This thing happens the whole time, inasmuch as the people concerned are identified wholly with the rational ego, or unconscious, as it is also said. So I suppose looking at gossip magazines and the portal which this opens for us to observe the lives of celebrities, and we can see this kind of dance going on where people hook up and so is going out with such and such, and then the next day it's all these terrible stories about how awful they are, the other person is, and the terrible things they did, and then this just goes on and on and on and on. And the reason it goes on and on and on is because celebrities really are perfect examples of unconscious humans, really. They're perfect examples, so we can learn a lot from that. But it isn't to say that you couldn't be a celebrity and yet be conscious. You could do that if you wanted to. If you were conscious, they probably wouldn't do, because it's kind of a stupid thing to do, probably. But for the most part, it's kind of like when people say, "Oh God, they're so dumb. How did they get to be so famous?" Because that's the whole point. They're supposed to be dumb. That's why we celebrate them, because they epitomise our own dumbness in a really perfect way. But it's so annoying. It degrades life to the level of a soap opera, and none of it's true. It's just a rotating. If I'm euphoric and happy and dysphoric and grumpy to the same extent, half the time I'm one way and half the time I'm another, I'm not anything, because they cancel each other out. I'm a nullity. So the concrete self, or the totally defined self, is always a nullity. And that's just another way of saying that it doesn't exist. When you do the books, when you do the accounting, it all balances out to produce nothing. So it's the fact that the rational ego is a nullity that constitutes the affliction that we're all suffering from. Okay, thanks for watching.